Hello, welcome back. So, this week we're going to talk about Unit 1. We're going to talk about the rhetorical situation and the many aspects of that. So, this video is going to cover a PowerPoint mostly, but I'm going to keep my face on the screen because I'll be explaining a few things. And then I'm going to go over at least one of the texts from this week. So, it does look like there's a lot of work. Typically, if this was on campus, we would cover all three of these texts in class and we'd be discussing them as a class. So, the way that I have it set up is not ideal for the way that I'd like us to discuss the texts, but it'll serve our purposes for an online class. So the PowerPoint that I'm going to go over is really about some of the key terms and rhetorical devices that we're going to talk about over the next few weeks and for the rest of the class. But basically, I'm going to give you the language to analyze the text for this week and next week, and also the language that you're going to use in your first essay. So, one of the things that I want to look at and examine with this first unit is essentially the choices, the rhetorical choices that writers make when they write something, right? So, this considers all aspects of that thing that I talked about last week, the rhetorical situation, which is essentially just the context in which a writer is writing in. So, the reason that they decided to write, what they're writing about, what they want to say, how they want to say it, how they want to address the audience, who their audience even is, how their audience might provide feedback or react to the thing that they're writing. So essentially, I just want to cover these things with you. If you have any questions along the way, just feel free to ask me and reach out. This is kind of dense at first, but I promise you, the more you practice it, and the more that you get used to using the language of this PowerPoint, the easier it's going to be. So something to keep in mind as you do the assignments this week. One of the things I'm going to be examining is how you use this language to analyze the videos. So try to really use the terms that you're going to see in this PowerPoint. And if you don't understand anything the way that I presented it, quick Google searches for this stuff can really help you out, because this isn't secret knowledge. It's very old knowledge. It's over 2,000 years old, so you really should be able to find the information quite quickly on the internet. So I'm gonna minimize myself up here so we can get started on the PowerPoint. Kind of have to rig it up a little bit so it's not ideal. I'm also using a brand new MacBook, so I don't yet have PowerPoint, so I'm using Keynote. So forgive any weirdness here. So essentially, we're going to talk about three key terms in this unit: genre, audience, and rhetorical situation. Now, I will let you know up front that audience is part of the rhetorical situation. So even though I'm sort of repeating myself a little bit, the reason that we're talking about audience separately is really because we're going to isolate and discuss the importance of the audience. So even though the audience is one key part of the rhetorical situation, we're going to be focusing on that for this unit in particular, and kind of notice how all the other aspects of the rhetorical situation are involved with audience. So we won't be talking about genre yet. We're going to talk about genre more next week. But essentially, this is the information. So I went over last week what rhetoric is, and it is essentially the available means of persuasion, right? That's the easiest definition. It is any tool or device at your disposal to essentially persuade your audience. Persuasion just essentially means to demonstrate something. So if you've successfully persuaded your audience, you have successfully demonstrated something to your audience. And what I mean by that is that the arguments that you make, or I guess the demonstration that you're providing, is either just self-evident, and so someone goes, "Oh, that makes sense now. I get it," or you've done something to get the reader or the viewer or listener to see something in a new way. And one of the things that we're going to talk about later in the semester is worldview, and I brought this up last week too. But essentially, if you understand who your audience is, if you understand their worldview, you can understand how to demonstrate something to them more effectively, right? And we'll see that when we talk about Manson in particular, but also Hilborn, because Neil Hilborn's video that's in this PowerPoint really goes over his worldview as someone that suffers with mental illness, but in particular someone that has obsessive compulsive disorder, and how that worldview really affects his everyday life, the decisions that he makes, the actions that he performs, and he has to be able to demonstrate that to the audience. And what's nice about Hilborn's video is that you visually see him demonstrating these things. So when he's talking about tics, when he's talking about compulsions that he does or obsessions, he's visually demonstrating them to you on the screen. So that's what's nice about his form of persuasion. So I showed you a form of this last week, and this is really a better way to look at it. I had some of the other terms up there. I had ethos, logos, pathos up there. I want to get rid of those for just a minute, because sometimes students get confused when they see those terms up there and they just think that the rhetorical situation is ethos, logos, and pathos, and that's just not true, right? Ethos, logos, and pathos are aspects of the rhetorical situation, but they are not the entire situation. The main parts of the rhetorical situation is what's on the screen right now. So the writer, the message, the audience, these are the three main components, right? This is the communication and process. And this is all occurring within a context with a purpose. So for instance, let's say in the sake of Marilyn Manson, right? His context is the Columbine shooting. It occurred in 1999. Immediately afterwards, he was blamed for it, which you get into later. But the context was the shooting occurred at a high school. Students sort of placed the blame, and parents and the community, and then eventually the media placed the blame on Marilyn Manson and said that he influenced these students indirectly to commit this crime. And so he's reacting to that, and he's defending himself. So his purpose is to defend himself, in the context that he's writing in is this larger context of Columbine itself, right? All the factors involved, the students, the parents, the culture, the community, his music, this all makes up the context. And then he is the writer of his message. His message is a defense. It's an argument. It's him trying to talk about why, maybe to some extent he should be held accountable to this, but at the same time, everybody needs to be held accountable, because it's not just one person that influenced this. It's everyone. It's the media, it's the parents, it's the students, it's the way the kids are treated, it's the mental health, it's all these factors that are involved. So his message is that before you point fingers, you need to look at yourself in the mirror and determine if you had anything to do with this, to which his response is that everybody did. And the audience is really just all of his detractors. It's anybody that he's trying to defend himself against. But in general, it's just everyone. He's trying to not just defend himself, but also discuss a larger, important message to society as a whole, to say that, things are messed up and we need to heal, but before we can heal, we need to understand where the real root of the problem lies. And that's with everyone. So in a nutshell, that's what the rhetorical situation is. Now, for those other terms that you saw last week, ethos, logos, and pathos, these are tools that the writer uses, modes of persuasion that the writer uses to persuade the audience. Let me move myself a little bit here. They can correlate in some ways to writer, message, and audience, which I'll show you in the next slide. But these are really separate terms. These are modes or tools that are used. Ethos refers to the character or credibility of the writer or speaker. So when we're talking about ethos, what we're really talking about is what makes that writer credible. What gives them credibility to write this message? What connection do they have to the message in general? When we talk about logos, logos quite literally refers to logic. This is your facts and figures and proofs and statistics and arguments that you make. This is the truth that you impart, or the wisdom you impart, or the information that you impart onto the audience. It makes up a significant chunk of your message. That's why we use logos. That's why it's usually listed with the message, which you'll see on the next slide. And then we have pathos, which just means emotion. It refers to pathetic. It used to be called the pathetic argument, but not pathetic in the way that we use it now. Pathos, pathetic meaning emotion, like empathy, right, or sympathy. So it is understanding human emotion, understanding how to reach out and grab the audience's attention and connect with them through emotion. So you see this a lot with politicians. They try to connect to their audience by using an emotional argument. So they'll say something like, my father came here, a poor immigrant without two pennies to rub together, and he worked 4 jobs just to support me and my mother and put me through school. And I was one of you down in the muck and living in squalor and blah, blah, blah. They're trying to connect to the audience by saying, like, feel sorry for me because I went through this thing. I'm just like you, right? Despite the $4,000 Armani suit that they're probably wearing when delivering the message, they're trying to connect to you in some way. So, to the next slide here. All right, so this is the image that you saw last week, and like I said, these 3 tools are something that the writer uses specifically, right? They're devices that the writer uses, but they correlate to these other things. So when I talk about the speaker or writer and ethos, these are listed together because it's referring specifically to the writer's credibility, right? What is the writer's ethos? How does the writer appeal to his or her ethos? Something that you'll see with Neil Hilborn, for instance, his credibility in talking about obsessive compulsive disorder is that he has obsessive compulsive disorder. So that adds to his credibility. He's credible to talk about this thing because he experiences it, right? It would be weird for Neil Hilborn to get up there and say, I'm going to talk to you about obsessive compulsive disorder, but I have no mental illness whatsoever. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? That doesn't give them a lot of connection to the message. It doesn't give them a lot of credibility. The reason that logos is related to the message, as I said before, is because your message is mostly made up of the logical proofs and arguments, right? Now, your message can also pertain to appeals to credibility or appeals to emotion as well. So ethos, logos, pathos are all part of the message. But most of your message is just arguments in general, logical arguments and facts. And then pathos is correlated to the audience because when you're using emotion in some way, you're using it with the intent of reaching the audience and connecting to your audience. So even though the writer is using that tool, it's specifically being used to reach out to the audience, connect with the audience on a more personal and emotional level. So I don't want you to confuse these terms as being interchangeable. They're not really interchangeable. The reason that they're listed this way is because they pertain to each other in some format. So that's essentially what we're going to cover this week in terms of rhetorical devices. But these are the questions that you're going to be asked about in the assignments for the week. So you'll see this come up a little bit, and I'm not going to go over this in depth. These are just ways to think about different aspects of the rhetorical situation. So, we want to look at, whenever we read any text in this class, whenever you read any text in the future, you want to ask yourself these questions, right? You want to talk about why is this writer making these decisions? What decisions are they making to reach me, the audience? And are they effective? This is really important because when you do something as simply as like watching an advertisement, right? An advertisement is trying explicitly to get you to buy something, right? No matter what it is, the ad is there to get you to buy a product, right? So understanding the rhetorical situation, you can look at that ad and go, well, what are they trying to sell me? What devices are they using to sell me? And should I buy into those devices, right? So if you're trying to be sold something, if a company is trying to sell you something, for instance, and let's say they're trying to sell you a vacuum cleaner, if their entire argument is based on emotion, right? Did you ever get sad when your house is a mess or that your vacuum cleaner just doesn't do what you want and you want to be happy, right? If they're just appealing to your emotion, that doesn't say a lot about the product. And a lot of ads, most ads do this now, right? They kind of avoid talking about the specifics of their product at all. All they're really trying to do is just get you to connect with the product and the brand. So you don't see a lot of logical arguments being used in advertising anymore. And that's really important because there's you interact with things all the time and you may not realize that you're being sold something. And so if you can understand the rhetorical situation, if you can understand these rhetorical devices and pretty much all the things that are on the screen, you'll really be able to defend yourself against being persuaded to do something that you wouldn't have otherwise done, right? Because that's kind of the point of advertising. So we're going to look at things like who is the writer, right? In the case of Marilyn Manson, he's a rocker. He's a cultural critic. He does write some journal pieces, right? But what's their credibility here? What is the writer's purpose? What do they want to impart on the audience? What are they trying to do to the audience? Are they effective, right? What do they want me, the audience, to think about? What's the context? What context are they writing or responding to? If Marilyn Manson is writing about Columbine, the Columbine shooting today, he might have less of a reason to do that today, but he could still talk about Columbine in the context of the onslaught of shootings that have occurred across the country, right? So if Marilyn Manson was to write that same article today, it may not be in direct relation to Columbine. It might just be in relation to other shootings. So again, ask yourself, what is their credibility? Can we trust them? If you look at, there's a really great ad for 5 Hour Energy, and I'm not going to put it up here, but you can Google it or YouTube it. It's really easy to find. It's 5 Hour Energy, and it is like the worst advertisement I've ever seen in my life. But it's essentially this woman dressed in blue. She's in this nice blue pantsuit kind of thing. She's sitting on a desk with a stack of papers sitting next to her, and she's making this weird argument that 5 Hour Energy is the healthiest energy drink on the market. And the reason they know this is because they surveyed 3,000 doctors, right? But then there's all this small text at the bottom of the screen, and it says, like, of the 3,000 doctors, only 500 were actually asked in person. The others filled out an online survey. All the doctors looked at for the survey was just the label of the product. So they didn't study anything about the contents of the bottle. They didn't actually do any kind of testing. The only thing the doctors actually were surveyed on is just the labeling on the bottle, right? Which for the 5 Hour Energy commercial was like, it has fewer calories than coffee. And so the label just says it has 4 calories, which is technically fewer calories than coffee in some cases. And it's definitely fewer calories than any other energy drink on the market. So it's very questionable. The tactic's very questionable about whether or not you should trust the person. Because as she's delivering this information, all this tiny text on the bottom of the screen's popping up. And if you can pause it to read it, it's really conflicting with what she's saying. And so it's really important to know whether or not the writer's being responsible, if they're being truthful. And we see this a lot with politicians, right? So it's very important to know this stuff for those reasons. Because if they can't be trusted, then their message probably can't be trusted. So that's important. When you look at the logical arguments, look at the evidence. Is it good evidence? Is it truthful evidence? In the case of the 5 Hour Energy commercial, it's not very truthful. There's limits to the truthiness of this person's argument for the energy drink. And also look at, how are they affecting your emotions? Are they trying to draw out your emotions to get you to feel a certain way? This is in really bad movies that don't do a good job of character development. They'll play a lot of heavy music, right? Because music is one of the best ways to reach someone's emotional center, right? And so when you see that kissing scene in like a romantic comedy or just any kind of scene where the music swells up really big, chances are that if you watched it without the music, you wouldn't feel any kind of emotional connection, right? And the reason they added such big swelling music is because they needed you to feel this way about these characters, right? Um, so ask yourself, what what is this writer trying to get me to feel, right? Are they trying to make me angry on purpose? Um, if you watch any TV show, and I'm binge watching Game of Thrones right now with my girlfriend because I didn't really ever watch it when it was out, mainly because people just kept telling me it was the best show ever. So I don't react well to when people say things like that to me. So I didn't ever really want to check it out. But I'm watching it with her because she was into it, and the character Cersei Lannister, she is just an awful person, right? Every scene that she's in, she's just cruel and malicious. And then her son Joffrey is even worse. Like, you didn't think you could hate anybody more, and then Joffrey comes along, and every time he opens his mouth, he just makes you hate him even more. And you have to ask yourself, like, am I supposed to hate this person? Uh, and in the case of them, yeah, they're not good people. If you like Joffrey or Cersei, you should really question who you are as a person, maybe, because they're just terrible people. But they're also written that way. They're written with the express purpose of getting you to feel this way about them because you're not supposed to connect with them. Whereas what's interesting is Daenerys in that show, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but everyone, for the last 8 years, everyone was all about Dany, right? Oh, Khaleesi, she's the greatest character ever. But as I'm watching this show now, she is ultimately the villain of the show. And I'm sorry if I'm upsetting anybody, but she is written in as one of the two main villains opposite the Night King. So I find it really interesting that so many people empathize with her, and I think that was probably the purpose of the writers, was to maybe get you to feel something for this character, despite really being a villain. I mean, if you look at what she does, she lacks honor in a lot of ways. Every time that she's offered something, she kind of, even though sometimes she gets screwed over, she really screws over the other party, and acts without honor in this world all about oaths and honor and keeping to your promises, right? And so ask yourself when you're watching a TV show, what am I supposed to feel about this character, and am I feeling the right thing? Because what's really interesting about Dany's character is, watching it now, I can see why everyone loves her. I mean, she comes across as this champion for the weak, and she tries to help um, any kind of slave that she comes across, and she sort of empathizes with those people because she herself felt like a slave in many ways. Um, but what's interesting about this is, because if you understand ethos, logos, and pathos, especially pathos, if you understand how a character might be written, let's say, uh, and you ask yourself, if you can question things as you're watching anything or reading anything, it can really help you understand who this person actually is, right? So um, are you at the behest of the author and just sort of believing in a character what they want you to believe, or are you thinking on your own? Because what's interesting about Dany is she does seem like this champion, but when you think about her motives, right, from the very beginning, she she thinks that her birthright is the crown, right, or the Iron Throne, because she was ripped away from it. But then the more that you learn in the show is that she was still a baby when this happened, so she doesn't even know anything about the kingdom, and she basically grew up outside of all of that. She has no experience of that world whatsoever. So for her to say that, oh, that's my actual life, you can agree with that to some level, but then at the same time, your actual life is an Essos all the way over here. Your entire life has been there. Um, that would be like, me being, I grew up for the first 4 years of my life in a townhouse, um, and then we moved to a different house when I was 4, and then to an apartment when I was 6, and then to my parents' permanent home when I was 8. And that would be like me now saying, "Oh, that townhouse is my birthright," and just going and kicking the people out that live there, um, and just squatting in it or living in it, right? And so what's interesting about that character is that when you look at what she does and why she does it, it seems noble, but then when you really look at what she's doing, it's not. I mean, when she gets her army in like season 3, um, she essentially kills all the people that she buys it from. Uh, and part of you is like, ah, yeah, she did a good thing because they were raising slaves, but then the other party is like, but she did it without honor. She reneged on her deal. Um, she had no right to do that essentially, um, because her father was essentially the same way. He was a crazy dude that was just running, um, that had slaves and was running a really bad kingdom. So, um, understanding these things, and I'm getting off on a tangent here, but it's interesting because if you understand these aspects of the rhetorical situation, it'll help you look at texts in completely different ways. Um, if anybody's a Harry Potter fan, it was quickly to reiterate the point. Snape, Professor Snape, uh, in that series, is written up until the very last book as a villain. You think that you're kind of presented with all this evidence that he is a bad person, that he is a villain, and that he hates Harry, and then you find out. Spoilers, sorry, it's been like 12 years since the last movie came out, but you find out at the very end that he's actually been playing this character on purpose, and that everything he's done has been to protect Harry because he's in love with his mom, right? So, um, if you know the right questions to ask, you can do some deeper digging and really get to the truth and the heart of the matter. And if you go back and read the series that I did, you really see all the little kernels that J.K. Rowling left, that suggested that he wasn't really a villain, um, even though she kind of wrote him that way on purpose to get you to think that way. So that's kind of how writers can use these tools to get you to think a certain way and persuade you of a certain thing. So, for instance, like J.K. Rowling writing Snape as a villain, she and people believing that until book 7, or movie 8, depending on how you read or watched the series, uh, was a good demonstration, right? She is a proper demonstration of him as the villain to persuade you that he was. Um, and so that's kind of how these devices work and what we're going to look at in terms of just other texts this semester. And then lastly, we want to talk about audience. Who is the audience? Who is the intended audience? And how effective is the writer at reaching that audience? One of the important issues here is that when you go to write something this semester, if you're writing to the wrong audience, or if you're writing something and not considering your audience, you might do a very poor job at writing that message. And depending on who the audience is, will really depend on what you say. So if you're writing about abortion, for instance, and you're pro-choice, writing an argument to conservative Republicans who are pro-life, or Catholics who are pro-life, um, you have to be very careful how you present that argument. You're not going to get very far unless you carefully consider their views, understand what they think and why they think that way, and the best way to reach them, and the best tools to use to reach them. Logic probably won't do it in that instance because for people that are pro-life, typically their reasons are not grounded in science so much as faith and belief and morality, their own morality. So, for instance, if you're going to deliver that message using logical arguments, using scientific facts about when life begins, or if a fetus is a human being, is probably not going to work with that audience. Using emotion, using pathos is probably going to be your better option, because if you can reach them emotionally with, look at these mothers over here who don't have the income or the stability or the security to really raise a child. If you focus on those arguments, then you might do a better job at reaching that particular audience. And on the opposite end of that, if you're pro-life, reaching out to a pro-choice audience, you could use pathos for sure, but you could probably use more logical arguments to suggest that, at this stage, a fetus is viable, and therefore, if it was born premature, it would have viability outside of the mother's womb, making it a human being, because we judge your sort of viability based on if you can survive on your own. So that's a way to think about tools that you want to use. And the audience really affects that. And also, if you're writing to either of those audiences, your credibility, your ethos, you want to appeal to that. Why would anybody listen to you if you're just some random person with an opinion on pro-life or pro-choice? But if you are well educated on the subject matter, if you've looked at all the different arguments, if you have done research into the abortion debate, then that gives you credibility and you can appeal to that. And understanding what the audience expects from you will help determine whether or not you need to use your credibility in that way. So now that I've talked your ear off about the rhetorical situation here and audience, I just want to briefly go over some of the readings. So this is Marilyn Manson. This is a more recent photo of him. So if you've never seen Marilyn Manson, he was kind of known as a shock rocker in the 90s. Very progressive type of music. He is an atheist, so a lot of his lyrics have to do with sort of critiquing religion and kind of making suggestions that there is no God. He has one song, and I think in one of the videos that you're going to watch, there's a lyric like, "I'm not a slave to a God that doesn't exist," right? So that's very much him. That's who he is as a person. And if you've never seen him, this image might shock you. It might frighten you a little bit. In the 90s, it definitely frightened a lot of people, especially the religious right. Now, that appearance might be a little bit more acceptable, but it's more acceptable because of people like Marilyn Manson. So what's really interesting about him and the readings for this week, and I have them up here, they're kind of small. His in particular is, if you look at this person in the 90s, during sort of the height of the culture wars, when Columbine happened, and there was one student that made a claim that the shooters listened to Marilyn Manson, which turned out to be just false. They had no evidence that was true. People listened to his music. They saw who he was and what he looked like, which is something like this. And speculation arose. This godless heathen corrupting the youth, right? That's always the argument when stuff like this happens. And so he's the writer of this article, Columbine, Whose Fault Is It? And really, his purpose is to defend himself. People were attacking him and sending him death threats and blaming him for the massacre that these kids committed. Let's go to the page here. So this is an image of him then when he's younger. And so this is his article. And really what he does in this one, which is interesting, is he just points out all the different, the various forms of violence throughout history, and he starts with the Bible. And the reason that he does this, and I'm going to go back to my presentation here. If we look at this slide, so he's Marilyn Manson, he's the writer. His credibility we'll get to in a second. His purpose is to defend himself against people that were blaming him for Columbine, which he had nothing to do with. And by the way, if anyone's not up to speed yet or they haven't read the article, Columbine was a really tragic shooting that occurred at a school in Colorado in 1999. And it actually didn't start off as a shooting. It was supposed to be a bombing, and the bombs didn't operate the way that the kids wanted them to. And so it ended up turning into a shooting. But it was one of the first shootings of its kind, and it is still relevant today because 20 years later we haven't learned anything. And his article is really interesting because he's writing about stuff that's still relevant, right? That if you look at it, if you read it now, you almost think that he wrote it today. So that's kind of his message and his purpose. If you look at the context, it's Columbine. His credibility in this case is that he's defending himself, so he knows his music and himself, but also he's a cultural critic. And what's interesting about that is he does this with his music. He does this with his journalism when he writes pieces. So he's always critiquing culture in general. And if you notice when you read the article, that's pretty much all he does. He doesn't really use statistics. He doesn't try to pretend like he's something that he isn't. He writes in the manner that he usually writes and critiques culture the way that he usually does. So that's his credibility, and that's also the logic that he uses is just looking at stuff and critiquing it. And then emotions, he gets really angry throughout the piece, and he kind of raises your ire throughout the piece, and he does that on purpose because he's kind of saying like, hey, you should be angry too. But something that I want you to consider when you read this is, does he use these tools effectively, right? Does he use the most credible arguments? Are his arguments valid? Does he need to use more credible arguments? Do you find yourself agreeing with him? Why or why not? Does his appeal to emotion, to anger, is it necessary? Is it warranted? These are questions that you need to ask yourself as you read all of this stuff. And what's really interesting about it that I like is if you read the article and don't see his face, he's very eloquent, he's very intelligent. And he addresses why he never went on TV to make this argument, which is his appearance. When you look at Marilyn Manson, a lot of people, especially in 1999, would have been shocked by this. If you saw this person on screen as a talking head in the news media, would you actually listen to what he had to say? And today, maybe you would, but in 1999, nobody would have. At least in the mainstream. Nobody in the mainstream would have. And that's why he wrote the article in print journalism, right? So that's what you have to ask yourself too. Why did they choose this genre? Why did they choose this medium? Why did he write in a newspaper, essentially, or a magazine? And it's because if anybody took one look at him, they would just immediately disregard anything he had to say. And so if you look at Hilborn then, I'm just going to jump down to this video. I'm not going to play the whole thing here. But if you look at Hilborn, he's up on stage, he's delivering a spoken word poem, and it's about obsessive compulsive disorder. And one of the things that's interesting about his piece is, and I'm going to skip to the actual footage here. So he's talking about obsessive compulsive disorder, which is very much a physical mental illness, right? And the reason that he chose this medium, for instance, of doing this on stage, performing in front of a camera, is because he actually performs the compulsions on the screen. So we'll watch some of it here.
The first time I saw her, everything in my head went quiet. All the tics, all the constantly refreshing images just disappeared. When you have obsessive compulsive disorder, you don't really get quiet moments. Even in bed, I'm thinking, they're locked door yet, the washman's yet, locked door yet, the washman's yet. So when I saw her...
So you see he's making these movements, right? And these are tics that he would do, and he's getting you to visualize what he does on a daily basis. And so it draws your attention, it ropes you in. So he needs to be seen, because if he were to write this on paper, it doesn't have the same effect. If you actually read the poem, the script for the poem, it does not have the same effect. He repeats certain words for that effect, but you don't get the emotional weight of it. You don't see the struggle that he undergoes. So if we watch a little bit more of this.
I feel like color than I did eating. But I walk home because there are lots of cracks on our sidewalk. When we moved in together, she said she felt safe, like no one would ever rob us because I definitely locked the door 18 times. I'd always watch her mouth when she talked. When she
So again, you see more of the compulsions. He's showing you just what this behavior does and how it could be for someone in a relationship. So if you watch the video, you'll understand. But being in a relationship with obsessive compulsive disorder, how this can be problematic because the compulsions and the tics make up so much of his experience and they're so visible. And what he's doing is he's talking about how, like, at the beginning of that relationship, they were she found it very endearing and cute that he did this stuff. But the longer that they were together, the more annoying it became to her. And so you begin to see his emotions shift here.
She loved me. Her mouth was a straight line. She told me I was taking up too much of her time. Last week, she started sleeping at her mother's place. She told me that she shouldn't have let me get so attached to her. That this whole thing was a mistake. But how can it be a mistake that I don't have to wash my hands after I touch her?
So that line there, how can love be a mistake if I don't have to wash my hands after I touch her, right? He's starting to get more emotional. The tone is shifting. He's using more pathos here, and he's showing you how this disorder really affects his ability to have a relationship, because for him this is something he does every day, and then he meets somebody and they think that it's cute or funny or endearing, because that's how a lot of people view obsessive compulsive disorder. But when you actually see the disorder in practice all the time, every day, it is really cumbersome. It wears you out. It's not cute. It's not funny like it seems to be presented. And so for Neil, what's really interesting about his poem here is that he's not only telling you what happened, he's visibly showing you the things that he does that kind of annoyed her and pushed her away. But at the same time, you see that he doesn't really have much control over it. So it's really not his fault. The other thing that's really interesting about this piece as well that I want you to consider is, and hopefully you do, how you can connect to this on a personal level, even if you don't have obsessive compulsive disorder. And that's what's really interesting about it. So you don't need to actually have mental health issues to understand where he's coming from. Because even if you don't have OCD or any kind of anxiety disorder, you probably do stuff that to most people seems annoying, right? And then you meet somebody and they think it's really cute. And it might just be a couple little things here or there that you do. And then 6 months later, a year later, 10 years later, that really cute thing that you did is really annoying to that person. The only difference between you and Neil Hilborn really is that he's saying, imagine that, but like on crack, right? 10 times worse all the time, every day. And how can he carry out a relationship with someone? And so for him, his purpose is to really explain and express his feelings, and also raise this awareness that he is at simultaneously he is trying to show you that this is really important and it really affects relationships and it affects people, that OCD is not cute like people like to think that it is. It's not a laughing matter. But at the same time, he's also getting you to realize that he's just human, despite that his issues, although problematic and constant throughout his life, are very similar in a lot of ways to like the average person's issue. So he's kind of, it's interesting because he's kind of saying like, hey, this is what OCD is. It's different than what you think it is, but at the same time, it's similar to what you do in a lot of ways. Just not in the way that people think, and not to be taken lightly. So that's more or less it for this PowerPoint. What I want you to consider as you move forward is these questions. Constantly ask yourself these questions. How do all of these aspects really affect one another? Like I said, this rhetorical situation here is representing the recursive process of communication and writing, meaning that all of these elements interact with and affect one another. So that's what I want you to consider as we read and watch these texts this week. And then lastly, I didn't talk about him, just briefly, and I'll keep this really short. Mike Lewis's piece, what I want you to consider is, what is his credibility, right? If you actually look up Mike Lewis's bio and you can do it on the Herald Mail website. Uh, he doesn't really have any credibility to write about heroin and Narcan, and I'm going to say that he doesn't, seemingly. So I want you to consider, how does he build his credibility throughout the text, and consider also, why does he not insert his own like his own words, his own analysis. He doesn't really express his own views at all through the article. So I want you to consider, why does he do that versus someone like Manson, who doesn't use any outside sources really, and only uses his own opinions and arguments. He only uses his own analysis. Uh, why are they different, and why can they be equally effective? Because I'm going to tell you right now, they are both effective in some way. So I don't want you to just say they're not effective. They are, but why are they effective, and why are they effective despite choosing different devices to use, despite doing completely different things in their messages? So if nothing else, I'm going to leave you with that. If you have questions, please reach out to me through Remind. I apologize for the breakup of the video. I had some puppy issue. He kind of jumped in and started barking at one point. But if nothing else, I'll see you in the discussion boards, and please feel free to reach out to me through Remind at any time.